actually, based on global polling data, the information shows that Filipinos are actually generally compliant with the public health advice. In fact, according to a global survey, we're one of the highest um, in terms of people who say that they wear masks outside the house and that they
So hindi
comply
tayo
with.
pasaway. So
Hindi
hindi
tayo
pasaway.
pasaway. And
Okay.
I think that's parang that's a relatively tempting narrative to point no that the problem is a lack of discipline, that people are not following the advice. But actually, if you go by the data that we have, people are generally compliant with the advice that is being put out by public health authorities. Now, however, and this is something that Dr. Troy Hepte mentioned, saying that you practice the advice is different from whether you do the advice as properly. Diba? I mean, people might say that yes, they do wear the mask outside the house, but whether or not they're wearing the mask properly, whether or not they're following appropriate distance, that's a totally different matter altogether.
So pwedeng pasaway tayo.
No.
I think the bottom line here is it sounds very simple when you say that you only have to practice 4 behaviors, diba? To protect yourself from COVID. Keep your hands clean, maintain appropriate distance, wear a mask, and cough properly. But in reality, those behaviors are actually very difficult to master and to make a habit in daily life.
Right. Yes.
What matters in what we know from behavioral science is at the end of the day, what matters is complexity, how complex the behavior is, and context. Where and when and how do we expect people to practice these behaviors?
Well, yun na nga yung tanong ko rin, no? Of the 4 behaviors in this protocol, which one do you think is the hardest to actually comply with? Is it the proper wearing of the mask? Is it the social distancing? Is it the washing your hands for 20 seconds, which is a lot, especially for women, because every time we go to the John, we're trained to wash our hands. So we waste a considerable amount of time washing our hands. But so among the 4 behaviors, which one would you say is the most difficult to master?
That's a great question. But the reality is it's very difficult to rank which behavior is more difficult to practice compared to the other. I think the reality is all of these behaviors sound simple in theory, but they're actually very difficult to practice. I'll give an example. Social distancing or physical distancing, we say that people should maintain a 1-meter distance from each other when you're going about your daily life or your daily activities. But what is 1 meter really? How do you know that this is 1 meter? How do you eyeball that? It's very difficult for people to make that calculation in every instance. And also, the reality is there are situations that it is nearly impossible for you to maintain that distance. If you go to a crowded place, for example, or you in some public forms of transportation, it's practically impossible to do that. So for me, actually, the question is, should we even expect or should we even put people in these situations when we know that it is difficult for these behaviors to be practiced? And that's a question for governance, I think. Should we be even exposing our citizens or the population to situations that it's practically impossible for them to even follow the advice?
I fully agree with Dr. Jason na talagang we should try to rethink about or reconsider kung ano yung mga pagagawa natin talaga sa ating mga kababayan. Kasi kung hindi naman talaga ganun ka-effective, we just have to come up with good feedback mechanisms to, look at our policies, our guidelines, and see what really works. And referring back to our question kanina about yung tungkol sa mga behaviors, Ma'am Lucci, I think yung social distancing is the really hard thing, yung how to estimate yung 1 meter, 2 meters away the distance. And people really have a tendency to come closer together. Kasi hindi tayo magkaintindihan, may mask na nga, tapos hindi pa tayo nagkakaintindihan.
Dr. Ligot, I'm curious about that because kanina sinabi nyo nga na there's a dissonance between what people will acknowledge is the proper thing to do and what they actually do or don't do. And you mentioned that this is certainly true for the Philippines. You mentioned the studies that you're looking at, but the studies that you're looking at also show a comparative the comparative distance or disconnect in other societies, other cities, other populations. Uh, are they more consistent in how they think and how they act? And what are they doing differently? Is it that their discipline is different? Is it that their infrastructure is different? Kasi I imagine there are the best performers among people, and then there are those who are not as good as them. What's the difference?
That's a great question. And I think it goes back to my earlier point, the one that I made about context. We tend to put too much emphasis on personal discipline when it comes to evaluating whether or not people are practicing the behaviors we want them to do. When in fact, it always occurs within a certain context, a certain environment. What that environment is, it can be your house, your school, your workplace. And this is where government, I think, comes into play when it comes to putting out policies and whether or not these policies are actually implemented. We should work under the assumption that you will never get 100% compliance with these target behaviors. And so you have to have the appropriate environmental supports, environmental nudges and structures to encourage or reinforce this behavior. Unfortunately, I cannot say with certainty based on the data that I know whether other societies are complying more better than we are. I can only reflect on our own particular situation. And what I can see in the environment is, simply put, Filipinos, I think a lot of Filipinos are placed in situations where, whether they like it or not, it will be very difficult for them to practice these behaviors.
Like, what are those particular situations that you feel government should be directly addressing?
For example, when it comes to public transportation, I think there's been a lot of discussion about reconfiguring public modes of transportation,
Yes.
etc. I think obviously it's a very difficult and complicated situation, but should we even require or should we even allow people to be moving so freely? I think that's a discussion we have to be making. And then workplaces. In fairness, I don't think the government has been remiss in putting out guidelines. So let's be clear about that. There are guidelines for many different situations, but the problem, I think, the gap lies in the implementation and whether or not these guidelines are actually being followed. And in this regard, we can work. I think there's a lot of space for working more closely with the private sector, with other sectors, in ensuring that these safety protocols are in place.